Thank you, Jessica. Who let the dogs out? My goodness. It reminds me of that BBC guy that was talking for the BBC one time, and then his little baby walked in, and the mother ran in after her. And anyway, fantastic presentations with Dapper and Lorraine. Thank you very much, and Happy New Year to everybody out there. I know it's getting late in the month, but I hope your January is going well. And my tech tip, the ECL tip for this session is called the 7 Faces of Loop, or the 7 Forms of the Loop Function. And I got the inspiration from the title from an old movie that had Tony Randall and Barbara Eden in it. And so later on I'll share with you the name of that movie, but that's where I got it from. And let's start with a quick poll question. One of these, this is a hard question too. These are not easy. These are not softball questions at this time. What Tech Talk episode previously looked at the loop function? And all of your choices did talk about loop in some way, but there was only one choice that introduced the loop function. All right, so I wanted to start this presentation with some kind of beautiful display, and so I searched for the 7-headed Hydra on Google. And I just wanted to show you this because the lesson here is that not everything you find on Google is accurate. Because as I started to put this graphic on the screen, I noticed, there's 1 head, there's 2 heads, there's 3 heads, there's 4 heads, there's 5 heads, there's 6 heads, 7, okay, whoops, there's an 8 head back there somewhere. All right, so anyway, be careful. Sometimes Google is not accurate, as we all know. And then the little guy in the bottom there, well, that's our documentation manager, Jim DeFabia. And when this all started around the holidays, and he saw some of the changes that were proposed for the documentation of the loop function itself hadn't changed that much, but just the way that we understand it. So Jim was like, help! And so to the rescue, we had a couple of people that I'm going to acknowledge at the end of this presentation that help with the documentation and to kind of clarify the use of loop. So here's the old form of loop. This was the old form that some of you will still see now if you look at the documentation that you have or press your HTML help. And notice there was only 5 forms that were mentioned here. Now, the documentation was still accurate, though. The loop function's purpose is to iteratively perform the loop body operation. And the counter that's part of loop measures how many iterations are being performed. Now, and also that counter keyword can be confusing because you can use the counter keyword inside of the loop body, and then it would control the counting of how many records it is iterating through for each loop iteration. So there's like a nested counter inside of the main counter. So anyway, during the holidays, we came up with some new loop documentation. Ta-da! So now instead of having 5 different forms of loop, well, it's been simplified to a single line here. However, if you take a closer look at some of the additional documentation, you'll see now that it really clarifies the use of loop and all of the other parameters. You need to have a loop body every time you use loop. But there are 3 options here called loop count, loop filter, and loop condition. And they are all optional, but you must have at least one of them present so that you can successfully exit the loop. And so you can also have combinations of them. And that's why if you take 3 different options, and those of you that are math majors out there will immediately know there are 7 possibilities. So that's what we're going to look at right now. What we actually did here, so the first example I'm going to show you, which is called form number 1, I want to say right at the bat here that the examples that I'm showing you right here are all standalone. Now, in the language reference doc, of course, like the record structure that's here with Fred Flintstone and Wilma Flintstone and so on is just used once and mentioned once in the documentation, and then they show you all 7 forms. So what I decided to do in this tech tip was to take and extract all 7 forms put them into separate running examples. So you could go through, download these, and then experiment with each form, and then modify the parameters and see how it changes the loop's output. So that's the goal here. That's why you'll see you'll see a lot of duplication of these record structures, and in some cases the body function that they use in the examples, because I wanted each example to be standalone. So the first example here, form number 1, simply uses a hard-coded loop count with the loop body. So in this example here, we're saying loop from this names table, again, our Flintstones and Jetsons and so on, and we're going to loop twice, and the loop body is actually taking an expression here, the rows of the left ampersand with the body function rows of the left, and then also passing it the counter. And the body function, is a function that we're calling, and so the initial data set here being 4 rows, each loop is actually going to be processing 8 rows a pop. So you've got the first loop that's going to be processing 8 rows. You've got the second loop then that will take those 8 rows and process them again. And the aggregate result will be 16 rows. Now the interesting thing here is you'll see there's a counter parameter in the Form 1 definition expression, but then on the left side there you'll see the project itself also uses the counter. And so in described above, the counter in the transform for the project in the body function counts the number of records processed by the current project iteration, but the counter in the loop function, which is past the body func, is the number of iterations the loop has done. So interesting result here. When you run this, you'll see that, again, as predicted, we have 16 records. The interesting thing here, though, is that 4th column in this output here that says counter CTR. And you'll see that, all right, the original 4 records had a counter that was initialized as 0, and then the body function started projecting through those first 4 records and gave us a 1, 2, 3, 4 count, because counter times the loop, which was C, passed to the function counter 1 times 1, 1 times 2, 1 times 3, 1 times 4, and so on. And so as we go into the second loop then, which is records 9 through 16, records 9 through 16, again, take the first 8 records, but then the counter of the project gets initialized back to 1. So it takes that 1, 2, 3, 4, and now we multiply that by 2. 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 2 is 6, 4 times 2 is 8. And then the result of that record there, we've got the 5, 6, 7, 8. 5 times 2 is 10, 6 times 2 is 12, because now we have 8 records. The first iteration, we only passed 4 records, but now we have 8 records in the second loop. So this is interesting, and the ages get accumulated accordingly inside of the body function there. And this is just form number 1 that's using a loop count with a loop body. Form number 2 now introduces a loop filter. What is a loop filter? Well, the loop filter will continue processing while it's true for any records that are getting passed to the loop body. So that's what happens is you start to reduce as you are running successive iterations of loop, and less records get passed to the, in this case, we've got an inline loop body that's just using project and then multiplying the age by 2 and then moving all the other values over to the output. So we're just concerned here with age in this simple expression, and we're only going to continue processing records whose age of the previous loop is less than 100. So interestingly enough, you're only going to have 4 records here because it continually loops through those rows of left, and then as it gets to the final loop, so we had Fred Flintstone at 70, it went to the loop, processed it, multiplied it by 2, and then of course Wilma, Z-Man had an age of 50 at that time, and so on. So the interesting thing about form number 2 was I think after about 2 passes, the loop processing halted for Fred Flintstone. But you can play with these parameters and keep going with them and experiment. Form number 3 actually uses a loop condition with the loop body. So now in the loop condition, it continually processes while the loop condition is true. And so this is similar to a while loop construct, and the loop condition expression is evaluated on the entire set of the rows records prior to each iteration. So unlike a row filter, which selectively only processes records that match that filter, this is a condition that says, okay, call the loop body only if this condition is true. All right, and so our result of this one looks something like that. All right. Again, interestingly, the counter is 0 right now because we're not really doing anything with that counter parameter, but I'm going to show you something interesting as we get into these last 3. Form number 4 now combines loop count and loop filter. So we have a hard-coded loop set in form number 4 of 10. The filter only processes records whose age is less than 100. So once again, as we run the loop count with the loop filter, I wanted to show you something here. The counter really is deceiving here because if you look at, it's using that body function again that is passing parameter to a project, and if you look at it, it's saying counter times C, counter times loop. So you get to Georgie Jetson, and even though the counter looks like 4, it looks like Georgie Jetson cut out before Mr. T, but that's not true because actually what happened was by the time it got to Georgie Jetson, which I believe Georgie Jetson has an age that's set at 10, it's the lowest age it's set, so it should be the last record that's processed in this test data set. So what happens is it was the only record that got to that loop. So the counter was 1, and I think the loop was in its 4th iteration there. So 1 times 4 is 4. So these first 3 records, Fred Flintstone, Wilma Flintstone, and then Mr. T, actually all stopped after the 3rd iteration of the loop, and then Georgie Jetson got in there one more time and was processed there. Because once again, we're talking about a loop filter here. Pretty cool. Form number 5 takes loop count with loop condition. All right, so we're doing a hard-coded 10, or if the loop condition fails, then we're also going to break the loop early. So it just gives you a little more muscle there as to when you want to break the loop. And then once again here, you've got your counter values here, which the counter values, once again, Georgie Jetson kind of hung out to the end there, and so that's why his counter value was low, because there was only 1 record processed in that particular loop. All right, form number 6, now we're taking loop filter and loop condition with the loop body. So the loop filter, again, now is going to be selectively only processing records that match that left dot age is less than 100. The condition in purple here is the condition that will break the loop, and there's our result there. And then again, once again, the counters, because they're calling the body func, once again, the first 3 records finished after the 3rd iteration, and Georgie Jetson finished on the 4th iteration of the loop. And finally, form number 7, everybody's at the party here. We've got a loop count, we've got a loop filter, we've got a loop condition, and we've got a loop body. So why would you want to do something like this? Well, you know, you've got your condition, you've got a loop hard-coded 10 here that says, okay, I only want to sample 10 iterations no matter what happens. So that's a hard-coded after 10, we're done no matter what. However, if for some reason the condition fails, the condition is false, even before it gets to loop number 10, then bang, the loop will immediately exit. And once again, left dot age is less than 100 will selectively only process records where that expression is true. All right? So form number 7, putting it all together, there's our result. And so you can run these yourself. You can kind of play around with the transform parameters to see different results, different H calculations. You know, I can see this now. Now, to me, this was a really good upgrade to our documentation because it helped me to understand loop a lot more. And I plan to when I dive into it now, I have a little more confidence in what method am I going to use. Each one of these forms is pretty specific as to its purpose. So there you have it. So before I go to our last poll question, let's just a real quick summary here. It's an immensely powerful function loop when iterations are necessary. The new documentation and examples make it easier to choose the right form of loop that you might need. And here it is right here. I want to thank 3 people particularly for helping me preparing this tech talk. First of all, Alan Roble over there in England, who had the initial JIRA report and was just kind of lamenting about how difficult loop was to use. We started emailing back and forth over the holidays. Jim DeFabia jumped in and said, yep, we need to upgrade the documentation. So he reached out to Richard Taylor and myself. And Richard Taylor and Jim both worked hard during the holidays to implement and write the suggested changes. So kudos to all you guys. And again, we can promise you in 2019 that a lot more is to come. So now that you've seen a new peek at the new and improved loop documentation, where can you get it? And so this is an easier question than the first one. Everybody should get this one right. So that will do it for the poll question. And let's go ahead and let me go back over to, there we are. So, Jessica,
all
back
right.
over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Bob. And speaking of loops, I forgot to have Lorraine's final poll question results, and frankly, I was kind of interested in the answer. So when Bob is done, we are going to loop back to Lorraine. So don't leave. When we're done, don't leave too soon. We'll ask that question. All right, so Bob, while you take a quick peek at the questions from the audience, I'm going to go to your first poll question, which was, which Tech Talk episode previously looked at the loop function? So this is testing whether people could find the wiki on our website to give us the right answer. It looks like 80% have said episode 16, which was August 2nd, 2018. 20% said episode 2, which was February 16th, 2017, and no one said Pro Agrica. So, Bob, I know.
Well,
Pro Agrica was an amazing one. You should go down and look at that. So, what's your answer, Bob?
Actually, in celebration of our 20th episode, we have to go back all the way to episode 2, which Richard Taylor talked about the loop function way back in our second Tech Talk episode. So I wanted to see if anybody went that far back. And, of course, I mean, I didn't remember it either. I had to look up all this information, also. But you know what? It's a testimony to the HPCC search engine, because I went in and I said, show me loop, and these Tech Talk episodes popped up. Episode 16 talked about a conversion loop in PB Blast, which is the machine learning library. And then C, which nobody picked, was Jeff Bradshaw talking about a farming feedback loop. But they all talked about loops, but Richard Taylor talked about the loop function.
All right, great. All right, let's take a look at our questions from the audience. It looks like we've got a few of them in here, so you can prioritize those. And Bob, we're going to go ahead and start with the first one.
All right, Well, first of all, this is kind of the silly question. What movie did the Tech Talk pay homage to? And the answer to that one was The Seven Faces of Dr. Lal. So that was one of those movies I saw as a kid, and just like when we saw 7 forms of loop, and, everybody that knows me knows that I get these crazy thoughts, and so that was my thought for the title there. Practically speaking, why should one use loop over the iterate function? Well, iterate is a different animal. It processes pairs of records. So Loop, though, however, can loop through the entire record set on each loop and then perform all kinds of other things that are necessary. So iterate's just good for pairs, left and right, left and right, left and right, where loop's iterations process the entire record set on each iteration if you need to do that. Let's see, what else do we have here? What types of real-world examples would be good for using loop? Well, you know what? That is a great question, and I'm going to maybe put something together like that. I think that to do some kind of a search engine where you're passing in some kind of parameter to the loop function and you parse out. I mean, the thing that comes to mind to me is like doing an inverted index search where you can pass a number of words into a loop function, and of course you can control the amount of how many iterations it takes based on the amount of words, and then the loop body can process the search into your inverted index. And I mentioned project being one way to do things, but you could possibly also write the function to pass it the search parameters and then bang against the data set and then produce a join output if you wanted to do that. So that's something I'm thinking of, a real-world example of using loop. And I've seen other people use other things, and also machine learning. I think if you search the machine learning library, I think they also use extensive use of the loop functions. You do progressive iteration. So each cycle, the machine learns more and more and more and gets smarter during the algorithm. All right. Let's see. Are there any plans for additional changes? Oh, yeah, that one. Yeah, like I said, we definitely are going to talk about going into other parts of the language that have been we listen to people, and your voice is important to us. So someone mentioned process. Maybe doing some enhanced examples on process. Some people mentioned maybe looking at graph again and looking at the options of graph and some of the other functions that are in there. And hey, your suggestions are important. If you want to email me directly, you can see my email address right there, and then myself and Richard and Jim DeFabia will all discuss it and work on improving documentation. All right, so I think that's it. Jessica?
All right, awesome. So we're going to look at your last poll question really quick. Your question was, now that you've seen a peek at the new and improved loop documentation, where can you get it? So 10% said Language Reference Manual, version 7.0.6. 20% said the ECL IDE, 7.0.6 HTML help. And 70% said both of the above. And the answer is, Bob?
Yeah, both of the above, definitely. So 7.06, and by the way, that's the cool thing about our GitHub and the way that the documentation now being on GitHub. Anytime a version gets upgraded, so does the documentation. So when you now download the PDF for the Language Reference Manual for 7.0-6, you're also, when you install the ECL IDE for 7.0.6, also get the updated HTML help for that very same version. They're always in sync now, and that's a very good thing.
Thank you, Bob. Always informative. Thank you very much for putting this together for us today.
All right, my pleasure.